The installation process is very similar. Both have GUI installers. The NixOS installer lets you choose a desktop environment. The Ubuntu installer does not. It will only let you install GNOME. So I'm going to choose to install GNOME under NixOS. You can get different desktop environments for Ubuntu. There are various flavors of Ubuntu. You can install Kubuntu, Lubuntu, Ubuntu Mate, different things. But the installer for plain vanilla Ubuntu will only allow you to install GNOME. I don't think it's particularly useful to go into much detail about the install process, how long it takes. They both take a similar amount of time. Both do approximately the same thing. You only do it once. Not a very interesting metric. A slightly newer version of GNOME is going to be installed on the NixOS side versus the Ubuntu side. This is not a point in NixOS's favor. This is just the way I've chosen to install these two operating systems. I'm installing an LTS, a long-term support release of Ubuntu, which is about a year old. It's 2204, released middle of last year. The nice thing about Ubuntu LTS releases is the company that backs or publishes Ubuntu releases security fixes for 5 years after an LTS release is released. And there's no such equivalent thing on the NixOS side. I think it's sort of a best effort thing. I think people try to backport security fixes across multiple releases of NixOS, but there's no organization or company backing NixOS. It's a bunch of volunteers. So on NixOS, you are going to be on a bit more of a sleigh ride as far as upgrades go. I think probably the window for security fixes over time, I don't think that a 5-year-old release of NixOS is going to be getting many security fixes. I think it's more like a year. All right, directly after we get installed here, Ubuntu has some features that I never use, which is single sign-on stuff, your online accounts. I don't even know what those do. It's good. NixOS has none of that. The first order of business here is a bit of difference in how updates are handled. Ubuntu has this pretty nice GUI way to get updates, and since we've just installed a year old piece of software, there are a number of updates that it has to do right off the rip. So it prompts you, and you can just click install now. You'll get your updates. NixOS is a different bag. You will never be updated by NixOS to get security fixes. You just have to remember, and you have to know. And the way that you do it, the way that you're usually going to be interacting with NixOS is through a terminal and through an editor. In this case, we're just going to use a terminal. And this is something you just have to know. Do sudo NixOS rebuild switch upgrade. And what this will do is approximately the same thing that Ubuntu is doing. It is going to go out and get the latest versions of all the software that's installed on this machine. The main difference between interacting with Ubuntu and interacting with NixOS is that you are going to be in the terminal a lot more under NixOS than you might be under Ubuntu. Both systems are now updated. Ubuntu tells you have to restart to finish installing updates. I think the reason it tells you this is because it upgraded the kernel. You don't have to do this every time you update your software under Ubuntu. It's just when there's a new kernel version. And I think the same is true of NixOS. It just doesn't tell you. You don't actually have to reboot. You can continue using the old kernel for as long as you want. It's just that the new kernel may have security fixes. So I'm going to just reboot both of them. So now that we have our system updated and installed and updated, I guess that's the proper order. The next order of business is probably to install some software because we have very minimal set of features now. I think we both have a web browser and some other stuff, terminal, whatever. Let's say that we wanted to install the command line utility called Git, which is a version control system. Ubuntu has I hesitate to call it nice. I'd like to call it nice, but it's actually kind of clunky. It's never been very good, but it does have this GUI installer for software and sort of you can browse for stuff and look around and find stuff to download. This particular thing, software updates. Didn't we just do that? Seems like as good a time as any to mention that Ubuntu has a bit of a split personality when it comes to packaging systems. They are in the middle of transition from a package system known as dpackage to one called snaps. And some packages are installed as dpackage deb files. And that is the legacy way of installing software on Ubuntu. It has been around for 25 years, 30 years, like that. Snap is a newer mechanism, and I think what's happening here is it's updating snaps as opposed to what it just did before. When we rebooted, it was updating the dpackage stuff. So it gets a little hairy, during the transition to figure out where stuff comes from, but it does work. So okay, so now that we have that, can we now? What can we do now? Can we go and install some software? Yes, we can. Okay, so let's say we want to install Git, the command line utility. So again, software store, you'd figure you just type in Git. However, there's a bit of a split between what it wants to install, what it wants to allow you to install via this Ubuntu software graphical installer, and command line stuff. Git won't show up in here. You kind of have to just kind of know that you have what Google will tell you all. If you just say I install Git Ubuntu on Google, you'll figure it out. The traditional way to get Git installed is to use terminal, to type sudo apt install Git. Go get Git for you. Now we have Git installed. Over on the NixOS side, life is different. Let's say we similarly go into the terminal, but that is where the similarity ends. There's no, there is a way to get Git installed where it looks a lot like that, but on NixOS in particular, the sort of right way to get Git installed is to cd to this Etsy NixOS directory. And if we look in here, there's configuration.nix and hardware configuration.nix. And if you watched any other videos or read about Nix at all, you'll recognize that these are the files that people talk about, and they say that NixOS can be configured through a single file. It's typically not a single file. It's typically once it gets complex enough, you need to break it down into multiple files. But in our case, since we've just installed, we have a configuration.nix, and that includes that configuration.nix has some hair in it to include the hardware configuration that it figured out during the install process. So it's effectively one file. It's actually two. So I think in order for us to get Git installed here, the right way to do it is to edit the configuration.nix. And this is a theme. You'll notice quickly that editing configuration.nix and then running that NixOS rebuild command that we already ran once is basically the way that you do everything on Nix. So I think the only editor I have installed here is Nano. So I have to use that too. I want to go down to this part of the file, environment system packages. And I happen to know that this package that we want is called Git, just like it was called Git on the other side in Ubuntu. We add it there. We save this file. And then we run sudo NixOS rebuild switch. We do not pass it the upgrade flag this time. We're not trying to upgrade our channel data, the repository information. We're just trying to, we're saying to it, I just made a change configuration file, figure out what it was and do the right thing for me. Okay, it's done. Do we have Git? We do. Those are two equivalent commands: apt-get install git and editing your configuration.nix and running NixOS rebuild. Equivalent. So let's say we want to install more of a GUI-ish thing. This Ubuntu software repository thing is actually better at that. But let's say we want to install Visual Studio Code. Do that. Install. Eventually, once it gets done downloading, it'll be installed. On the NixOS side, things are different. We do the same thing we did last time when we wanted to get Git, and we edit our configuration.nix. And we go down to our environment system packages. And I happen to know that the package that we want is called code-fhs. Now, how do I know that? Well, I'll show you. So often what you're going to need to do in NixOS is go to a web browser and go to this handy web page called search.nixos.org. And we want to search for Visual Studio Code. One thing about NixOS is that sometimes when something is very popular, like Visual Studio Code is, there'll be a number of variants of it in the search results when you search for it. This one works better for me because it does extensions the way I'd rather do them, but either one of these would work. So I happen to choose VS Code FHS, but either one would get us Visual Studio Code. So I already edited it, or I already added it there. So configuration.nix, it is in there, code FHS there. So what do you think we're going to do? We're going to run rebuild switch again. This pattern is very common in NixOS. You edit your configuration files, you run this one command, and it does the needful of whatever changes you made. Did I get the name wrong? VS Code FHS. Yeah, I didn't get the name right. VS Code. So, as you might intuit up to this point, if you are uncomfortable in the terminal and editing files on the file system and all those other things that that we're doing here, and this is nonsense to you, then you might want to go with Ubuntu, because NixOS is done this way. This is how it's done. And what I think that means in practice is that if you have a lot of experience with Linux, I've been using Linux since 1996. So all this foo-for-all over here, the Snap Store and the Ubuntu software thing and all that stuff, I never use that stuff. I always use terminal and install software. However, if you're new to Linux, this stuff is super useful. So NixOS is more on the sort of journeyman to expert side of people. It's more friendly to people who have been using Linux for a long time, or at least using something for a long time. So, okay, we've installed code on both of our systems. just do the code and code. Godot. Code. And we can see that we've wound up in approximately the same place. I think these are slightly different versions of code. Okay, what about commercial software? Well, the answer to that is quite simple. If you need to run commercial software on Linux, you should run Ubuntu. NixOS has some support for proprietary software or software packaged by its authors rather than stuff that's in the NixOS repository. Like you can run Flatpaks, you can run snaps on NixOS. However, lots of things, let's just take, for example, Microsoft SQL Server for Linux, for Ubuntu. Microsoft packages, you can run SQL Server, their SQL Server product on Linux. They support Ubuntu and they support Red Hat. And they do not support NixOS. So I'm not going to show you head-to-head here. I'm just going to show you this webpage that tells you, you run these commands and, they support Ubuntu 20.04, Ubuntu 22.04, slightly different for each one. This doesn't work at all on NixOS. There are other pieces of software, like I happen to use a piece of software called Mixbus by Harrison Consoles, which is like an audio processing thing. That is not packaged for NixOS. It installs fine on Ubuntu. In order to use it, I could use it on NixOS, but I would have to write the thing to turn it into sort of a NixOS package, which is non-trivial. It is not something for the faint heart to have to do. So very simple. If you need to run commercial software, you're probably going to be better off running Ubuntu, or at least if you do run NixOS, you want to run a virtual machine inside of NixOS to run commercial software. Got it? Okay, let's imagine you're a distro hopper, or at least a desktop environment hopper. In NixOS, one of the features of NixOS is that it makes some things quite easy that are comparatively hard on other distributions. So open a terminal here. We'll interact with our configuration file. Inside of this file, this is basically everything about your system. Everything that's not in your home directory is configured through this file. So we somewhere in here have the GNOME desktop environment configured. And in order to switch, let's say we wanted to use KDE Plasma instead of GNOME. We can take these two. The display manager for GNOME is traditionally called SDDM. We're just going to change this to SDDM. And instead of GNOME, we'll say Plasma. I think it's Plasma 5. Plasma 5? Maybe it's, I don't know. We'll find out. Save it. And our old familiar sudo NixOS rebuild. Switch. And as we can see, we are downloading a bunch of software and installing it. Okay, we're done. Let's see what happens if we restart. Log out, log back in. Ooh. I think we have to do it from a terminal. Terminal. I'm just going to reboot. I honestly have no idea what's going to happen here. Didn't try it before. Looks like KDE to me. We're now running KDE instead of GNOME. So I would try to do this over in Ubuntu, but I know better. I there you can do it. You can add some apt packages and faff around with configuration files and all sorts of stuff, but it's effectively better left to reinstall on top of if you wanted KDE, you install Kubuntu or some other variant that is based on Ubuntu that has KDE in it. I've never actually. I mean, I think I might have once successfully got it to switch desktop environments, but very very infrequently. So yeah, so NixOS makes this sort of stuff very easy. There are certain things about NixOS that is just way easier than any other distribution. That happens to be one of them. So now we have an SSH server running. One other thing that is nice to have is to have an SSH public-private key pair set up, so you don't have to type in your password when you log in. More secure as well. To do a little cheating here, look at my existing configuration on my host system. Yeah. So this little stanza is underneath of my user configuration in here. So I'm going to change this in on my NixOS guest system that I'm using to demonstrate. Okay. So what we're doing here is we're telling NixOS that these are the authorized keys that can be used to sign into the Chris M account on this machine. And the private key pair, the private side of the key, is obviously private, so I can't show it to you, but it is on my system. So, yep. Switch. Got to put that in there. What that did was it added some configuration to our SSH keys D stuff. It added it to that file in there. And let me see if I can find out the IP address of this machine. My host system terminal. Yep, I can log in without a passphrase. On Ubuntu, things are a little bit different. You have to go into a .sh directory in your home dir. That's not created by default. I made that. And then you have to edit a file called authorized keys. And I'm just going to take it from over here. Copy. And I think I have to change permissions on it. Keys like that. And I will open up a terminal on my host machine. I gotta see what the IP address of this thing is. 92.168.122.92. Copy. Yes, now I can log in. So the main difference here, if you're noticing a theme here, in Ubuntu, we're doing everything in the imperative style, meaning we're making changes to configuration that do not get recorded. We are making one-off changes to our operating system every time we add a file or change a configuration file, whatever. Over NixOS, we are changing the configuration file, and it does get recorded. And what it means is that if I need to recreate this system somewhere else, I can just install it and copy my configuration.nix over, run NixOS rebuild switch, and have more or less the same environment that I started out with. On Ubuntu, not so much. Now that we've got our SSH nicely configured, let's imagine that we are human and we decide to go messing around inside of our Etsy directory. And inside of our Etsy directory, there is a directory called SSH, which has all of our SSH configuration for our server and our users. And let's say we just make a mistake. We say sudo rm rf SSH, like that. Now, this is on NixOS. On most systems, if we didn't want to just sort of recreate that from scratch, just by typing it all, we'd have to restore from backup in some sense. NixOS has this concept of generations. Every time you run NixOS rebuild switch, usually, it will create a new generation. And because of the way that NixOS is in charge of managing your configuration files, basically everything outside of your home directory, and because the way you interact with NixOS is to change your configuration file, run NixOS rebuild switch again, you're not editing these things directly. You're always going through this intermediary, this configuration file intermediary. We can switch back to an old generation and be up and running again. So I will show you that. Our SSH directory is gone right now, but if I go and restart, go to this NixOS all configurations thing here. Configuration 8 is the one it got removed in, so we're going to move back to configuration number 7. Our SSH directory is back. Now, the one thing it doesn't have in it is our user information. The chrism user's authorized key, the public side of his authorized key, is not in here, but we can easily get it back by running sudo NixOS rebuild switch. Because our authorized key is recorded in our configuration file. And now we have an authorized keys D file in there, directory in there that has chrism in it. So now at this point, even though I blew away my SSH directory and blew away all my configuration, I rolled back, I regenerated the configuration for my user. I should be able to now log in to that system. Let me check the IP address again. And yes, I can. So there's a roughly similar feature in Ubuntu if you use a ZFS root file system. You have some limited subset of what NixOS might give you. I don't know that you could actually recover from this particular mistake by using that, but that is actually still an experimental feature in Ubuntu, and I don't think very many people use it, and I don't know how well it works, but it is certainly not really in the traditional wheelhouse of Ubuntu to be able to do that. There are a number of other things I'd like to show, but I'm afraid this video is getting a little long, so I think I'm going to sort of cut it off there. There are a number of other advantages in NixOS that I find useful. One is being able to run very, very old revisions of software. That is not so easy on Ubuntu. NixOS makes that particularly easy. It's very helpful. And as you might imagine, because we're recording all this stuff as we change our configuration file, and if it's just text, we can just back it up or check it into version control or whatever, we can replay it at any given time. You can sort of make the mental leap that it would be easy to manage multiple machines if we just make slight changes to that configuration between those machines and sort of share most of it, which is what I do here. There are a number of other downsides in NixOS. It is not a file system hierarchy standard. Is that what it's? Yeah, compliant Linux distribution. So sometimes doing software development on it is Not much fun, although it's billed as a sort of, developer's distribution. It can make life a little bit difficult in cases like that. There are various workarounds for that. There is another piece of software called Home Manager that does the same thing for your home directory dot files as NixOS itself does for your operating system. If you mistakenly blow away you know, your bash RC or something like that, you can get it back by rolling back to another generation or whatever, changing things like that. And it lets you manage your dot files inside of those Nix files, like the configuration.nix. The bottom line is that if you are new to Linux, I would suggest using Ubuntu. If you have a couple years of Linux under your belt, I would give NixOS a shot, see how you like it. The bottom line is that it really boils down to whether you prefer the sort of imperative style of configuration where you're not interacting with the system through this configuration file. You're actually making changes directly to configuration files on the file system. If you prefer that, I would go with Ubuntu. But if you like the idea of having all the stuff that configures a system in one place, NixOS is your jam. So thanks for watching.